Meanwhile, the head of the United Nations mission in South Sudan, David Shearer, has met with President Salva Kiir. The two have discussed improving cooperation in the fields of security, the distribution of humanitarian aid, and resettling of internally displaced people.
Thank you very much. How are you?
The United Nations has reiterated its commitment to carrying out its mandate and working alongside the government for the good of the people of South Sudan.
We agreed that cooperation was necessary at all levels between the UN and the government.
David Shearer says the deployment of the Regional Protection Force will enable existing peacekeepers to expand their operations to different locations. This includes patrolling roads where civilian convoys have been attacked, as well as repairing roads. Shearer has also discussed efforts to assist about 213 internally displaced people to return to their homes. He says it's vital that the government ensures the security and humanitarian situation in their communities. Beryl Oro, CGTN.
Well, to discuss more on this issue, we're now joined by Wang Hui in Beijing and CGTN's Mariam Zaidi, who is joining us from Brussels. Wang, I'll begin with you. Just unpack for us the role China has in helping with the social and economic reconstruction of South Sudan.
Well, the Chinese government hasn't officially responded to the U.S. sanctions imposed on Southern Sudan, but China has been providing assistance to Southern Sudan since the 1970s, before South Sudan became independent. Back then, China assigned a medical team to work there, agricultural experts to teach the locals how to grow rice and help them build bridges. Bilateral economic and trade relations have been developing smoothly since South Sudan became an independent nation in 2011. In the same year, the two sides signed bilateral trade, economic, and technical agreements and established a joint economic and trade committee. As of January this year, about 100 Chinese-funded enterprises have registered in South Sudan, related mainly to patrolling, construction, roads and bridges, and communications. The Chinese government has also been actively involved in South Sudan's economic and social construction. This includes building hospitals and schools, carrying out human resources training, digging wells, providing musical instruments and medical equipment, and other emergency humanitarian supplies.
Right, Mariam, in Brussels, I'll come to you next. South Sudan, it could be argued, needs more assistance at this time and not isolation. What is the European Union's position on getting the country back on track?
Sure. Well, the EU has always been one of the biggest donors in the area. They provide over 40% of the overall humanitarian response. And, since South Sudan spiraled into this bloody crisis, the EU has made some 423 million euros. That's almost €500 million available to respond to the worsening humanitarian crisis. And just in 2017, 182 million euros were mobilized to deal with the humanitarian consequence of the crisis. So this sum also includes 112 million euros for partners in South Sudan, for example, aid agencies on the ground. The EU has also given over 70 million euros to address the refugee crisis in neighbouring countries, so Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia and Sudan. Now, just last month, the EU pledged over €1 million to then help with water and sanitation projects. So would the EU then turn its back on South Sudan and potentially isolate it? It seems to be no. The EU humanitarian response is never conditional or based on political issues. For example, its aid to Turkey or Syria. There is no political basis for it. So just because of a change in position, say, for example, in the US, there won't be one from the EU vis-a-vis aid and helping the people most in desperate need. But of course, access is, of course, important.
All right, Wang Hui, coming back to you, when it comes to peacekeeping, China has, of course, been at the forefront of efforts in South Sudan. Just take us through some of the contributions it has made to stabilize the country.
Well, in January 2005, China witnessed the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement between the South and North, which ended the 38-year-long civil war and announced the establishment of the autonomous government of South Sudan. Since then, China has had formal friendly exchanges with South Sudan, and the bilateral cooperation in various fields has increased progressively. Furthermore, when the Republic of South Sudan was formed in July 2011, China also established official diplomatic relations with the new country, becoming one of the first countries to establish such relations with it. China has been actively helping the African country maintain peace. At the end of 2013, when the conflict in the country broke out, China mediated actively. Beijing met delegations from both the South Sudan government and the anti-government sides. China also initiated 4 proposals to facilitate the two sides reaching a consensus. Finally, the related parties signed the agreement on resolution of the conflict in South Sudan in 2015, and China was one of the witnesses. Now, in order to maintain peace and stability in South Sudan, China has assigned peacekeeping troops and medical teams there. Back to you.
All right, and Mariam, still on the EU, is the Union planning to send more personnel into South Sudan to further boost security?
Sure. Well, you know, just a few months ago, back in July, the EU, UK, US and Norway, under this umbrella organisation, the Troika, condemned the ongoing fighting and called for a respect of the ceasefire and, of course, return to peace talks. Now, in South Sudan, the EU response is essentially humanitarian in nature. It had a security training mission in the country, but that ended in 2014. Now, European Union missions are, though, training soldiers in Mali and Somalia, and also Nigerian police officers. You know, the EU ships also patrol the Mediterranean and the coast around the Horn of Africa to control human trafficking. So what we could say is, you know, the EU, along with some individual member states, have boosted their capacities for mediation and civilian crisis management, but the real sort of political work of peacemaking, you could say, in African conflicts is really left to the UN and African powers themselves.
All right, Mariam, thank you very much for those insights. To both of you, thank you for speaking to us here on Africa Live. Wang Hui in Beijing and Mariam Zaidi joining us there from Brussels.